Hello everybody and welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you like Therian and furry content, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the like button on this video. Now, today's video is a very simple concept but has a lot of interesting details, which is the difference between Therians and Furries. Believe it or not, Therians and Furries are two completely different groups. And yes, you can actually be a Therian and a furry, but Therians and Furries are completely separate identities with completely separate labels, so let's get into it. Let's start with Therians. Now, a Therian is someone who non-physically identifies as an animal. Now, that definition can mean a number of things and is kind of a bit confusing, so I usually say that it is someone whose internal sense of self is an animal instead of a person. When you look inwardly at, the concept of who you are as a person, and you think, okay, this is me on the inside, usually what you picture would be what your body looks like. Now, that's not always the case, and for Therians, a specific animal or a number of animals can fill that spot. So instead of visualizing yourself when you're thinking of yourself, you visualize an animal, and essentially that's what being a Therian is. Now, there are 1,000,001 different ways to be a Therian and identify under that label, and that's what makes this a bit more confusing. So therianthropy is something that is actually not as defined as you would think. See, people actually argue and fight over different definitions and sub-definitions under therianthropy and alter humanity as a label in general. But being a Therian, technically the only thing that you have to do is to non-physically identify as an animal. There are other, rules and situations that apply sometimes in different definitions depending on who you ask, such as things like having it not be a choice, but there's also differences such as being a spiritual Therian versus a psychological Therian, or even a physical Therian. There is a whole lot going on with the labels in the Therian community. Now, it is important to note that being a Therian has nothing to do with wearing masks or gear or doing quads. Now, a lot of the Therian content you see posted on the internet is posted with people wearing masks, like what I'm doing, or doing quads, or things like that. Now, those actually have nothing to do with being a Therian. Not all Therians wear masks, not all Therians make masks, not all Therians like masks. It's just a part of expressing your therianthropy. So it's more of a creative outlet and a way to express kind of what your internal self looks like on the outside. It has nothing to do with the actual label. So a lot of Therians out there don't wear masks or do quads or interact with those kind of trendy Therian ideas in general. Now, there's nothing wrong with making masks or using gear or doing quads. It's just that's not for everybody. You might also notice that Therian gear, which is basically anything that makes you feel connected to your stereotype, essentially, it also looks different than the gear that a furry would have. So this mask specifically, with the open eyes, and it's more realistic and only fits on this portion of my face, this is more of a Therian style mask. Now you could Now they can be referred to as Therian masks. I don't personally find a problem with that just because it really is a way to just get more reach. But technically they are masks for everyone and are not just for Therians. But this is a Therian style mask. I bring this up because when you move into what a furry is, you might see that their kind of gear is completely different. Now, it isn't always, but fursuit heads cover your entire head and look like this. See, this is more of a fursuit style mask. It covers the entire head and is covered in faux fur. Now, this one is an exception to kind of a standard fursuit because I did make the face out of foam clay, but most fursuits essentially are huge overhead kind of things like this. So with that, what is a furry? Now, a furry is actually a very broad definition, and it essentially just means that you are a fan of anthropomorphic animals, or animals with human traits, which could literally mean that if you just are a fan of the movie Zootopia, you could technically be a furry. But the important thing about the furry label is that it's self-applied. Nobody can say you are a furry unless you identify as a furry. See, a fursuit is not necessarily a required thing to be a furry, as the definition is just being a fan of anthropomorphic animals, but having a fursuit also doesn't mean that you are a furry. Some people have fursuits just because they like the costume, or just because they wanted to have it. It doesn't mean that they are a furry for owning a fursuit. So then, is a furry a label that you identify with in the same way as a Therian? Kind of. See, the thing is, a Therian is a very specific internal identity that affects your very sense of being. And being a furry doesn't really go that deep, at least not for most people. But technically, there is a blurry area between furry and Therian that some people reside in, and that's completely okay. Now, do furries identify as animals? Technically, no. Most furries don't actually identify as the animal they're dressing up as, they purely like dressing up as that animal. But some furries, again, might dance that line in between Therian and furry, but for the most part, furries do not identify as the animals they are dressing up as. Which brings us to an interesting kind of gray area, which is to say a fursona. Now, a fursona is basically a character based off of you. It's like a persona, but fursona because it's a furry, but it's you as a furry. And people draw their fursonas, and it can be their main character, it can be the main focus of their drawings, it can be their fursuit, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that persona is the same thing as themselves. Now, some people might identify that closely with their personas, but typically they don't. Now, a stereotype for a Therian, which would be the animal that you see as your internal sense of self, has a bit of a stronger connection for most Therians than a fursona would to most furries. See, a fursona is kind of like an external representation of yourself, and a stereotype is more of an internal representation of yourself. And I think that's actually kind of interesting. That's an interesting parallel there, but fursonas don't typically carry the same weight and level of identity as a stereotype would for a Therian. Now, can you be both? Earlier in this video I said yes, you can, and yes, you can. See, being a Therian has nothing to do with being a furry, and both can exist at the same time. In fact, I am both a Therian and a furry. So in conclusion, both Therians and furries are completely different things, but you can be both. And a Therian is a self-identifying label as your internal sense of self as an animal, and a furry is someone who is a fan of anthropomorphic animals. And that's essentially the difference. If you guys liked this video or got some interesting information out of it, make sure to hit the like button on this video and the subscribe button to my channel. I post every single day Therian and furry content, as well as arts and crafts that you can make at home. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.